Hello, my name's Tom Ward, and I'm talking today about the collapse of the City of Glasgow Bank and the consequences that it brought. You've probably never heard about the City of Glasgow Bank, but you should have done, because the consequences we're still living with today, even though the collapse itself has long since been forgotten. In banking circles, it can probably be compared to the equivalent of the sinking of the Titanic and the effect that that had on society at the time and the effect that it had on the shipbuilding industry. It was a similar kind of cathartic event. Just to put the thing in context, the disaster itself, the collapse of the bank, is actually quite well known. It's quite well documented. So for those who choose to go and have a look, you can find the evidence as to what happened, the trial of the directors. It's all on the public record. There are books and manuscripts in the National Library if you wish to go and have a look at it. What I particularly studied, though, is something that I don't think anyone has done before. I did a thesis examining the internal records of the Bank of England and the Treasury and the other authorities who had to deal with the aftermath of the collapse as to what the people directly concerned actually thought at the time they were doing it. The most important records are those held within the Bank of England. And the Bank of England is not a government department. It's always considered itself to be an independent institution. It keeps all of its own records, and it regards client confidentiality as being paramount, which essentially means that they won't release any of their records for 100 years after the date of the event. They did give me access to their records, and I think I'm probably the first person to have been through them in detail. The story that emerges is fascinating. Go back a few steps. The bank collapsed as a result of reckless lending and mismanagement. Just to put it in context, banking in Scotland in the 19th century had been dominated by the Edinburgh-based banks, but they were regarded as rather slow and conservative, very cautious in their lending. And with the growth of Glasgow as a very major industrial and trading city, naturally, Glaswegian businesses wanted their own bank, which led to the formation of the City of Glasgow Bank. The bank, of course, though, was subject to all the same kind of pressures that most businesses are under. Pressures of expectation from the shareholders as to continued growth and prosperity. Banks in those days published very little in the way of detailed accounts. The most important information they published was the decision by the directors on the annual dividend and the chairman's statement. So as far as the board of the City of Glasgow Bank was concerned, the dividend was just going to go up every year, and the chairman would issue a nice positive statement. But how could you actually get the growth to deliver this? Growth beyond that of the local economy could supply? Well, you'd go further afield and you engage in lending that other people would perhaps turn away. So the City of Glasgow Bank, growing to be the largest in Scotland and the third largest in the UK, actually found itself on the day of collapse with 80% of its loans to just 5 customers. And most of the value of this was nowhere near Glasgow. It wasn't supplying the Glaswegian manufacturers and shipbuilders. It was actually financing the construction of speculative railroads in Wisconsin and agricultural land for improvement in Victoria and New South Wales. Subjects about which the directors of the Glasgow Bank, frankly, knew rather little. For several years before the collapse, the bank had actually been struggling. It made its accounts balance by coming up with a balancing figure. The balance sheet has to balance. The figure they ended up actually making up was the value of gold that they held. So that's what they did internally. But the banks externally kept on presenting a picture of growth and prosperity. The collapse, when it came, was very sudden. And the collapse happened because of a loss of confidence in the interbank market. Sounds familiar, perhaps, to those of you involved in banking now? And the Bank of England declining to offer any support. Remember, this was 1878 when this was happening, October 1878, and this was the first real test of the doctrine by the Bank of England that they would provide almost unlimited support for any British bank which had a liquidity problem, but they would not support banks which were judged to be insolvent. Solvency was a matter for the shareholders to put in enough capital. The Bank of England was not prepared to start risking its money or the government's money on issues of solvency. So the bank collapsed, and here's an irony. The following day, the directors called a shareholders' meeting and they appointed an independent accountant to review the reasons for the collapse. The independent accountant published his report 2 weeks later, and that report showed the scale of the mismanagement within the bank and the extent to which the directors had presented a false position. The following day, the directors were arrested. 3 days later, the shareholders' meeting took place with none of the directors in attendance because they were all refused bail. That's what happened in 1878. One of the biggest things about it, though, was what happened to the shareholders and to the depositors in the bank. Despite the bank being such a large institution at the time, huge in Glasgow, every depositor and every creditor was paid in full because the bank's shareholders had unlimited liability. This was something that very few of them had really focused on at the time. To be a shareholder or a director of a bank in the 1800s was a very prestigious position to hold. And the idea that a major bank would actually become insolvent just didn't seem to have occurred to many of them. So the shareholders had unlimited liability, the liquidators calculated the deficiency, and they issued a surcharge on the shareholders to pay the deficiency. And the first surcharge they issued was for £500 per £100 of nominal shares, so basically 5 times the amount which the shareholders had initially put in was the surcharge. That first surcharge bankrupted many of the shareholders who were simply incapable of paying, and they just turned over their entire estates to the liquidators. So a second surcharge followed shortly afterwards, again to make up the deficiency, and the second surcharge came to 22 times the amount of the initial investment by shareholders. And there were a few very wealthy shareholders of the bank who were able to pay, but many more shareholders were bankrupted by the second surcharge. And in the end, about 95% of all the shareholders in the bank went into bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy. But the depositors and the creditors were repaid in full. Just as another example as to how dramatic this was at the time, the British government was very concerned about the possibility of civil unrest in Glasgow because of the economic dislocation that they were concerned could follow. That led the Bank of England to provide very large amounts of support to other banks which were suffering liquidity issues, but there were also extra troops who were moved to Glasgow in the event of civil unrest. This was done in conditions of great secrecy and was not known at the time. Fortunately, the troops were never required. The biggest thing that followed, though, which is relevant for today, is the aftermath. This was a terrible shock to the system, such a large and prestigious bank collapsing without warning. The directors went on trial. They were all convicted of fraud and false accounting, and every director was sent to prison. And this was, and it remains, the only occasion in British history when every director of a major bank has been sent to prison. But the reforms, what had led to this problem and how could it be solved? How could it be mitigated in future? That was what preoccupied public debate. And there was very vigorous debate in the press and in Parliament as to how this could be changed. The concept of unlimited liability for shareholders was now finished, because the experience of the City of Glasgow Bank meant that no wealthy individual would ever again become a shareholder in an unlimited liability bank. Because if other shareholders became insolvent, you would just end up paying yourself to the full extent of your assets. And so if no wealthy individual would ever become a shareholder of an unlimited liability bank, are you just going to be left with poor people who are shareholders? Well, that defeats the entire purpose of it. And therefore, the concept that banks had to become limited liability companies was established. But there had to be a price to be paid for this. And the price to be paid was that banks were now seen for the first time as having a significant responsibility to people other than just their shareholders. Banks could no longer be considered as essentially private companies with no further obligations to other people. So banks were now seen as having a broader responsibility. The amount of capital that banks had was now a matter of public interest, that they were properly capitalised. And the real price to be paid was that for a bank to convert to limited liability, they now, for the first time, had to have an independent audit carried out. And bank accounts had to be produced and published in proper form. Now, today, this may seem to us to be fairly obvious. It wasn't quite so at the time. There was some interesting controversy about whether audit of bank accounts would actually produce anything useful. It's a subject that remains of interesting debate amongst people today, actually. There was a rather good letter published in the Times in January 1879 on the subject of audit of banks, arguing that it would be both futile and mischievous. Futile because no professional auditor can really ascertain whether the assets of a bank have been properly valued, and mischievous because, if attempted, it would tend to relieve the directors of responsibility which they are bound to undertake, and which duty, if they are incapable of performing, they are unfit to continue to be directors. I think that's quite well put, actually. So there's an argument against it, but the argument that was not upheld in the end, and so a professional independent audit became mandatory. So the concepts that we still have today that came out of the collapse: first of all, the overriding concept that banks do have a much broader responsibility than the just private duty to their own shareholders. Secondly, that banks have to be independently audited and, of course, have accounts in a proper detailed form which is published. And the final reminder that recklessness of management will always end up in grief. That's a lesson perhaps that we have to keep on relearning every time. So today, when we look at our modern banking system, just think back occasionally. There was tremendous distress caused by this collapse, but out of it, the system as a whole, the political system, the legal system, the debate amongst the press and in Parliament, I think was of an astonishingly high standard, which led to the Banking Act 1879 becoming an Act of Parliament less than 12 months after the collapse actually happened. So there's a few things just to ponder on. Huge collapse, directors arrested 2 weeks later, the day after the accountants' reports published, directors all sent to jail on a trial that took place 3 months after the collapse, new Banking Act less than 12 months after that. Job done. So we should sometimes ponder and think, well, are we doing things as well today? I'll leave you to think about that. Thank you.